Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to now introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, Transforming Society to Research and Innovation, which will be presented by Professor Subra Suresh, President of the Nanyang Technological University, who's always shaped humanity. We are most privileged to have with us this morning Professor Subra, the President of the Nanyang Technological University, a renowned global scientist entrepreneur, who shares with us his story on how science and technology are transforming society. He's also the senior advisor to Temasek International, previously served as the dean at MIT School of Engineering, president of Carnegie Mellon University, and director of the U.S. National Science Foundation, been nominated by President Barack Obama. As director of the U.S. National Science Foundation, Professor Suresh launched the Global Research Council and the Innovation Core program to translate research discoveries into industrial practice. This has now been replicated by a number of organizations in the US and abroad to assist scientists to become innovators and entrepreneurs. Please join me in putting our hands together to welcome on stage Professor Suresh. Professor?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I would like to take about 20 minutes or so in this presentation to set the scene partly from historical perspective, partly forward-looking on thinking that went into transforming societies through innovation and entrepreneurship. This is something that the Singapore government is extremely committed to through investments, through a variety of programs, including the RIEC, Research, Innovation and Enterprise Council, that started in 2006. So before we get into some of my talking points, let me start with a historical perspective on how visionary thinking about the seeds of innovation can completely transform the economic prosperity of a country or a region. Oftentimes, this historical lesson is overlooked. So I'm going to start with the year 1862. So especially for the AI girls sitting in the front, I just want you to jog your memory about what the significance of the year is. This is the time of the Civil War in the US, starting in 1860. 1862, the US was at the peak of the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln was the president, arguably the most impactful US president ever. He was president only for 4 years, little more than 4 years, and he was assassinated. At the middle of the Civil War, when the country was being torn apart, millions of Americans had died in internal strife. Abraham Lincoln had a lot to think about. But one of the things he did with the then Congress was to create the Morrill Land Grant Act, which essentially gave land to public universities, created a university ecosystem that still to this day is the envy of the world. So if you take the top 100 universities in the world, 2/3 of them are still American universities. A lot of the origin of that ecosystem can be traced back to this, which University of California system is one of the prime examples of a land grant system that has transformed higher education around the world. If you look at 1863, still during the Civil War, President Lincoln had a lot to think about, and he created the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Not only did he create a National Academy of Sciences, the way in which it was created was something spectacular. It is an independent arm. It was created by the government, but it has nothing to do with the government. It is a private enterprise which advises the government, which equally criticizes the government, and it can provide insightful advice to the government. So it doesn't receive funding from the government for its existence. It's privately operated, but it receives funding to develop reports that are advisory to the government and provides testimony to the Congress. So this is another remarkable, so these two can be traced back to the innovation ecosystem of the US more than 150 years ago. Let's fast forward to the Second World War. Right after the Second World War, when the country was trying to rebuild itself, when the national debt was a significant fraction of the GDP, one of the foremost technological thinkers of that time was Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the first dean of engineering at MIT. He's one of the computer pioneers. And my last job at MIT was as Vannevar Bush Professor of Engineering. And I never had the good fortune to meet him. He passed away in the 1970s. He was invited by Washington to advise them on the role of science, especially basic science. This is what Steve started with as Deep Tech's mission. The role of science in economic prosperity and innovation of the country. So Dr. Bush, in the mid-1940s, published a report called Science, the Endless Frontier. It had four major theses. Number one, the economic prosperity of a country necessarily depends on innovation. That's not controversial. Number two, innovation necessarily arises from basic research in science and engineering. That was also not controversial. The third thesis of his report was that innovation is best done in universities and colleges in partnership with industry and government so that you have the opportunity to train young minds who become future leaders in various sectors of society. And universities also have the luxury of a long time horizon, and basic research inherently is a longer term proposition, which industry, because of the demands from shareholders, is not well equipped to do. This was an interesting argument at that time. That was also not controversial. But the fourth point that he made was extremely controversial. He argued that it is the responsibility of the government, especially the federal government, to fund that basic research. So when the report went to the White House, it was summarily rejected the first time. He persisted. It went back again in 1950. In 1950, Harry Truman was the president of the US, and Truman accepted the report and created the US National Science Foundation. So this is essentially the impact of the report that created the innovation ecosystem. His report also played an important role in the creation of the National Institutes of Health and also NASA. So NSF's annual budget today is $7.4 billion US dollars. NIH is about $35 billion US dollars, and NASA is about $15 billion US dollars. The science, technology, innovation, startups that have come out of that enterprise is staggering, and that's why it's no surprise that despite all the issues that we face, the US has remained, especially since the Second World War, the unquestionable innovation leader by any metric. So the natural question that arises is, if you give that kind of money, taxpayer money, to the innovation ecosystem, what is the return on investment? This was a question I was challenged every time I had to testify to the US Congress as NSF director. So here is the response. NSF was created in 1950. Since 1950, about 240 American Nobel Prize winners have had some significant portion of their Nobel Prize winning work funded by the National Science Foundation. There is no other investment of that magnitude that has contributed to the innovation ecosystem to such a powerful extent. So that's point one. When in the 1970s, the Congress wanted to create the Small Business Innovation Research because small businesses create more jobs than major companies, they did not go to the Department of Commerce. They did not go to the Department of Health and Human Services. They did not go to the Department of Energy. They went to the National Science Foundation to create the first SBIR program. Now, pretty much every government agency has an SBIR program. Third, when Qualcomm was a mere startup, it was actually Linkabit in San Diego, Irvin Jacobs, one of the co-founders, needed $25,000 to survive. NSF gave him $25,000. In fact, I have Irvin on videotape telling me if he had not received the $25,000 then, Qualcomm would not have survived and become Qualcomm, which now employs 21,000 people worldwide. Symantec, when it was a startup, received $25,000 from NSF as a seed fund. Just in the 1990s, 2 young graduate students did a purely mathematical work funded by NSF called the PageRank method at Stanford, and their names are Sergey Brin and Larry Page. That's the return on investment. So you can go on and on. So this is what Steve talked about, science through engineering, creating value for society through technology, through products, processes, and services. So I mentioned about the small business innovation research. By congressional mandate today, out of $7.4 billion, NSF sets aside $200 million a year, about a little more than 2%, specifically to fund startups and small businesses, phase 1, phase 2, et cetera. This is a very, very important part of research, and this leads to a lot of innovation. I want to give you a more recent example. About 7 years ago, we wanted to create a program at the National Science Foundation, try to see, without spending a lot of money away from basic research, which is very scarce, what are the kinds of things that we can do all across the US, in a very large country, across 3,000 institutions, where a small amount of money can have a huge impact. So this is what we came up with. So about 200,000 people a year receive NSF funding. Let's say you receive funding for 3 years or 5 years to the tune of about $500,000. At the end of it, everybody publishes a paper. Many people file patents, but most of the ideas die at that point. They don't see the light of day. So what can we do to grease the wheels? So we decided that we will ask these grantees near the tail end of their project to write a 1 or 2 page proposal, and we had to change the systems at NSF so that we will give you a response within 4 weeks. You write a very short proposal, within 4 weeks we'll tell you whether you get $50,000 for 6 months. With the $50,000, you're not supposed to do new research. You take the research you have already done and see it can go further beyond just publications. So if you can demonstrate it as economic value, good luck to you. You're on your own. Go find a VC, go find the money. If you fail to demonstrate it as any economic value, good luck to you. We have nothing more to talk about. Either way, there is no further engagement. So we put in $6 million out of a $7 billion budget, so less than 0.1%, which is a noise in the system. I want to tell you what the outcome is 7 years later. So it was officially launched in 2012. In just 6 years, more than 1,000 projects have been funded all across the US. And Georgia Tech recently did a study of the success rate of these programs compared to the success rate of programs pre-I-Corps, similar programs, and the success rate is 3 times as much. And this is because one of the requirements of the program is a boot camp where university professors, postdocs, and graduate students are forced to go to a 3-day boot camp where VCs, CTOs, and people who have succeeded and failed in the marketplace will tear them apart. Initially, everybody hated it, but now it's viewed as one of the highlights of the program. So a number of entities, including NRF in Singapore it's called the Lean Launchpad. A number of entities have adapted various versions of this. Australia has a very large program across many of this, modeled after I-Corps. And we also have in India, the Irish National Science Foundation, NIH, Department of Energy, Department of Defense in the US have all started an I-Corps-like program. So this is one example of a way to spur innovation on a large scale across the US and for countries large and small. I want to show on the innovation investments, input and output for research. So this is the latest graph created by Battelle in Columbus, Ohio. This talks about feeding the innovation ecosystem around the world. It's a very complicated graph, but let me just simplify it as much as possible. On the horizontal axis, you need money to do R&D. So investments in dollars as a fraction of the GDP of a country. So it's normalized by the economic size of the country. On the vertical axis, it's the number of scientists and engineers normalized by the population of the country, or 100,000 people. How many scientists and engineers you have per 100,000 or a million population. So the vertical axis is people power. The horizontal axis is economic power for R&D. The size of the circle is the size of the investment. Larger the circle, larger the investment. It's color-coded so that blue is North America, yellow is Asia, you have red is Europe, green is countries that don't quite belong into any of the major continents, Israel, Russia is there. So if you look at this and focus just on the colors, still the largest in the world is the US, the size of the circle. But China has grown significantly. In fact, China will surpass the US in the next couple of years. You want to be on the top right corner of this graph. You want as much money into R&D as possible, and you want as much talent as possible. So you want to be in the top right. The countries closest to the top right are Finland and South Korea. Israel is far to the right, but it doesn't have enough people yet, but it is a very powerful innovation engine. Singapore is doing very well, and you can see where Singapore is just above the US. So Denmark, Finland, Norway, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, they're all here. So this graph sort of illustrates on a global scale. Asia is a little more than 1/3 of the world input. Europe is slightly less than 1/3, and the US is roughly 1/3. So that's the global trend. So let me finish with a last few points. Since the purpose of this meeting is going to be on blockchain, AI, etc., things that are driving the fourth industrial revolution, I want to highlight a few points about some of the issues related to the fourth industrial revolution. So the basic ingredients, as this audience knows very well, are driven by robotics, AI, blockchain, IoT, personalized medicine, autonomy, etc., etc., where we view in the fourth industrial revolution as the unique convergence at an unprecedented pace of the physical world, the digital world, and the biological world. So one of the topics that keeps repeatedly coming up is what is going to be different about the fourth industrial revolution compared to the three previous industrial revolutions. So definitely every industrial revolution has disrupted lives and jobs. Eventually it created more jobs than it destroyed. Every previous industrial revolution led to improvement in the human condition, but it also led to unintended consequences. Every previous industrial revolution was faster than the preceding one, and the fourth one is much faster. But still, there are some things unique to the fourth industrial revolution, and because the purpose of this meeting is to focus on this, I want to highlight a few issues that I've been focusing on for the last few years, mainly through my co-chairing of a Futures Council for Production for the World Economic Forum in Davos for the last 2 years. We just finished our final report. My co-chair is Sharon Burrow, who's the General Secretary of an organization in Brussels that coordinates all the labor unions in the world. So we've had a lot of opportunities to talk about the positive and negative aspects of the fourth industrial revolution. There are many positive aspects of this. I also want to focus on a few issues. I think one of the key things that's going to be different in the fourth industrial revolution compared to the previous three is going to be the human interface with technology. And there is a simple reason for this. And the simple reason is that the individual citizen of the world, there are 7 billion of us today, soon to be 10 billion in a few decades. through mobile technology, can access cutting-edge information. And the number of these people is increasing very rapidly, even in developing countries. I think that's one major reason for the greater emphasis at the individual level of human interaction with technology, which can completely transform either the positive implications or the negative implications and unintended consequences of the fourth industrial revolution. Let me just take one unique human characteristic. So as we talk about the point of singularity, where the machine intelligence almost begins to match human intelligence, some people think it could be 10 to 20 years from now. Some people think it may never come. Some people think it'll come in the second half of the 21st century. Whatever happens, machines can handle much more data at a given time on a globalized scale than humans can. So assuming that we reach that point, let's take one typically human characteristic, dignity. Dignity for a Chinese national living in China could be somewhat very different than dignity for a Chinese Singaporean or a Chinese American because of their life experiences, societal implications, and their local environment. So the definition of dignity for all of us is extremely individualized and unique. When machines agglomerate massive amounts of data, will they understand the nuances that you and I understand of what dignity means for you and what dignity means for me, and the differences between the two of us because of the differences in the paths we have taken to reach where we are today? It's not clear. So this is just one example of many things. Ethics is again highly influenced by culture. Will machines with massive amounts of data be able to parse out the individuality and the nuances of ethics, for example? So this is my last but one slide. I want to focus on 6 issues that is important as we talk about AI, as we talk about robotics, machine learning, big data, IoT, etc. First is the rate of job creation versus rate of job destruction. So this morning, the World Economic Forum that's meeting in Tianjin, in fact, we have 6 of my colleagues who are attending from NTU today, and they've been looking at, so they announced that they predict that by 2025, Industry 4.0 will create 58 million new jobs. I don't know how that number was arrived at, but this is their prediction. They also predict that there'll be net gain in jobs over a period of time, but that's not the issue. In the previous industrial revolutions, there was a net gain in jobs, but the job gain followed job destruction by several decades. Given the rapid pace of change, if there is a significant time lag between job creation and job destruction, there'll be massive societal disruption, evidence of which that we are already seeing in North America, Europe, UK, and many other places in the world. So the question would be, what is the time lag between job destruction and job creation, and what will be the expansion of inequality between those who are educated and those who are not educated, and the gap? And that's going to be very critical. The second is, what is the role of how do you define an educated person, especially for people who run universities? If somebody gets a university degree at age 22 and goes for productive employment, and they are expected to have a productive career in the succeeding 50 years, and they have to continuously learn new things and change jobs, they don't have an opportunity to go back to the university. What is the minimum body of knowledge that we are supposed to impart to our graduate students by the time they graduate, when they get a university degree, that qualifies them as a so-called educated person, that prepares them for lifelong learning, however we define it, without having to go back to a university to receive another degree, which most of them may not have a chance to do? So does our curriculum reflect it? Are we adequately preparing them? So one of the things we started this year for all 23,000 undergraduate students is every student will be required to have a minimum number of credits to satisfy what we call digital literacy. So it doesn't matter whether you are an arts major or a literature major or a computer science major, you have to satisfy this requirement for digital literacy to be a productive citizen of the 21st century, no matter where you live. So this is especially important for AI girls because girls excel in education more than boys in most countries in the world today. The third, because of the human characteristic slide that I showed, what is the definition of being human? And if machines make decisions that can potentially even slightly alter what we cherish as classic human characteristics, do we lose some of our humanity in the process of being able to respond to massive decisions and policies created by machines? And especially given the fact that the pace of technological progress is way ahead of the ability of organizations, in many cases governments around the world, to react to the pace of technology to formulate policies and practices and regulations. I mentioned about the point of singularity, whether it comes or not. If major decisions are made by machines at some point in time, will humans have the opportunity to reverse those decisions? Who will authenticate the veracity of the data that goes into making decisions on a massive scale by robots? And who is entrusted with that responsibility? And how do we know that data is valid? Because if it's garbage in, it's going to be garbage out. And how do we make sure in a globalized world where we have no control over the source of data or the authenticity of data that we'll have the opportunity to reverse this? Every intended benefit comes with an unintended consequence. So let me give you one example. In the year 2000, the US National Academy of Engineering released a report, which is on a website. It's called the 20 Greatest Engineering Achievements of the 20th Century. So things like air conditioning, without which Singapore cannot exist as a thriving economy, air conditioning, refrigeration, commercial aviation, internet, microelectronics, advanced materials, creating nuclear power, et cetera, et cetera. Then in 2003, the same National Academy of Engineering released another report called the 14 Grand Challenges of the 21st Century. You can also find that on their website. If you put the two reports side by side, you cannot help but wonder whether some of the 14 grand challenges are a direct consequence of the 20 greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century. Carbon sequestration, pollution, congestion, containing nuclear terror, securing the cyberspace, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, if we were so smart as engineers and scientists in the 20th century to create all these wonderful inventions and innovations, what did we miss in the process of creating these unintended consequences, which are now the challenges of the grand challenges of the 21st century? As we try to solve them through Industry 4.0, what guarantee do we have that we will not end up creating more unintended consequences and grand challenges for the 22nd century? My last point is the following. This is a very subtle point. The technology is so advanced that we have perfection and precision in everything we do. The atomic clocks are precise to a trillionth of a second. We have precision medicine. We have CRISPR. We can edit a single DNA. We have a GPS that precisely locates within 1 meter. We have precision bombing through drones remotely. So we are so precise, but humans and art and music, there is beauty and truth to imprecision. So as technology and Industry 4.0 forces us to be more and more precise and accurate and perfect, what kind of human characteristics do we lose by the very task of being imprecise, failing, and most startups fail? So failing is a natural part of human existence. That's how we learn from childhood all the way to end of life. So will we lose that? Will machines force us to be more precise and more perfect? So this is another thing. So my last slide, I want to end with what are we doing as a university? So earlier this year, because of the significant interest and importance So we have a lot of wonderful colleagues doing cutting-edge research in Industry 4.0, in all the basic ingredients of Industry 4.0 at our university. But what we also want to focus on is how the human interaction with Industry 4.0 emerges. So we established an institute called NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity. Of course, it's a very broad topic. We want to focus on 3 things to go deeper and make impact. And you will see activities on each of these coming in the next few months. First is responsible innovation in each of these. Second is governance and leadership, from ethics to policy to regulations. How do we work with different organizations to prepare this? Third is 70% of the global population will live in urban cities. How do we create, and Asia is going to be the epicenter of this, the new urban Asia. So these will be the 3 focal points with which we'll work on these topics. So with that, I hope I have given you a few thoughts for the conference. I wish everyone a wonderful and rich discussion. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Suresh.